I want to start with something that is going to reframe everything you thought you understood about what it means when someone pulls away. Because we have been taught by culture, by common sense, by the very logic of human behavior, that distance means disinterest. That when someone stops calling, stops engaging, stops showing up with the warmth they once offered so freely, it means they have moved on. That the silence is a reflection of how little you now occupy their thoughts. And if you have ever been on the receiving end of a narcissist's withdrawal, you will know exactly how devastating that conclusion feels. Because you are still there, still thinking, still replaying, still trying to make sense of a silence that feels like a verdict. But here is what I need you to understand clearly and without qualification. The distance is not the truth. The distance is the performance. What the narcissist presents to the outside world, and specifically to you, is a carefully curated image of someone who is disengaged, someone unbothered, someone who has, with remarkable ease, redirected their attention away from you and toward the rest of their perfectly functioning life. And it is convincing. It is designed to be convincing because the alternative, allowing you to see what is actually happening in the privacy of their inner world, would hand you precisely the kind of power they have spent their entire psychological lives making sure no one ever holds over them. The reality, and this is supported not just by clinical observation, but by the fundamental dynamics of narcissistic attachment, is that you have not left their mind, not even close. The narcissist's inner world is not the calm, indifferent space their exterior is designed to suggest. It is crowded, it is loud, and you are, in all likelihood, one of its most persistent and consuming inhabitants. Now, to understand why that is, we have to understand something about the nature of narcissistic attachment, because it operates very differently from the attachment patterns most of us are familiar with. For the narcissist, other people are not simply companions or loved ones in the conventional sense. They are, at a deep psychological level, regulators. They regulate the narcissist's sense of self, their sense of worth, their sense of stability in a world that their nervous system has always experienced as fundamentally unsafe. This is what Heinz Kohut described when he wrote about self-objects, the people in a narcissist's life who function not as separate individuals, but as extensions of the narcissist's own psychological infrastructure. You are not just a person to them, you are a function. And functions, when they go offline, do not simply fade into irrelevance. They create a system-wide disruption. So when the narcissist pulls away, when the cold front moves in, and the warmth evaporates, and the silence stretches into days, and then weeks, what is actually happening inside them is not peace. It is not indifference. It is a kind of internal turbulence that their exterior is working extraordinarily hard to conceal. They are thinking about you. They are monitoring you, even from a distance. They are tracking, consciously or not, whether you are pursuing, whether you are hurting, whether you are moving on, because each of those possibilities carries a different implication for how safe and significant they feel within themselves. The withdrawal is not the end of their engagement with you. It is engagement by other means. The silence they handed you was never about your absence from their mind. It was about controlling how much of that truth you were ever allowed to see. There is a word we reach for when we want to describe someone who cannot stop thinking about another person, who monitors their movements, who replays interactions on a loop, who is perpetually attuned to what that person is doing, feeling, and how they are responding to the world. That word is obsession. And it is a word we almost never apply to the narcissist because the narcissist has worked very hard to make sure we apply a different word instead. The word they prefer, the word their behavior is carefully engineered to suggest, is indifference. This is one of the most sophisticated and damaging deceptions in the entire narcissistic playbook. Not because it is always consciously orchestrated. We have already established that much of what the narcissist does operates below the level of deliberate intention, but because it is so devastatingly effective. The image of someone who has simply moved on, who has redirected their energy, who is living their life with an ease that stands in brutal contrast to your own sleepless nights and unanswered questions. That image does something very specific to the person on the receiving end. It inverts the reality of the situation entirely. It makes you feel like the one who is too attached, too affected, too unable to let go, while they apparently have already let go with minimal effort and zero visible consequence. But let us look more carefully at what is actually happening, because the behavior that reads as moving on, the sudden social media activity, the conspicuous public appearances, the ostentatious displays of a life being lived fully and freely, is rarely the organic expression of genuine recovery. It is, in most cases, performance directed at a very specific audience. And that audience is you, the person who is supposed to see it, the person who is supposed to feel it, the person whose reaction to it is being anticipated, monitored, and in some cases actively engineered. The psychologist supply chain, and I use that term deliberately because it captures something important about how the narcissistic mind operates, requires constant replenishment. What the narcissist is seeking at all times is confirmation of their significance, evidence that they matter, proof that they are affecting the emotional landscape of the people around them. And here is the critical insight. Your pain, your pursuit, your inability to simply detach and move forward with the same apparent ease they are projecting, all of that is supply. All of that feeds the system. Your suffering, as brutal as it is to name this directly, is not a side effect of their indifference. It is, at some level, the intended outcome of their performance. This reframe is not comfortable. I am aware of that. There is something almost unbearable about the suggestion that the person who appears to have forgotten you is, in reality, acutely and continuously aware of you, because it raises an immediate and agonizing question. If they are thinking about you, if they are monitoring you, if your reaction matters to them this much, then why? Why the distance? Why the silence? Why the performance of a life from which you have been so thoroughly erased? And the answer brings us back always to the same place. Because knowing you are in their mind and showing you that you are in their mind are two entirely different things. One gives them information, the other gives you power. And power in the narcissist's internal economy is the one currency they cannot afford to let you hold. They are not indifferent to you. They are addicted to you, and the performance of indifference is simply the most effective way they know to keep that addiction hidden and keep you destabilized enough to remain within reach. There is a concept in psychology that I want to introduce here because it unlocks something essential about why you specifically, not just anyone, but you have become such a permanent and consuming presence in the narcissist's inner world. And that concept is the mirror, not as metaphor, not as poetic device, but as a precise psychological description of the function you have been serving in this relationship, possibly without ever being told, possibly without ever consenting to it. The narcissist does not experience relationships the way most people do. For most of us, a relationship is an encounter between two separate selves, two people who bring their own distinct inner worlds into contact with each other, who are genuinely curious about the otherness of the person across from them, who are changed by the encounter in ways they did not entirely predict or control. That mutual otherness, that genuine separateness, is what makes intimacy both vulnerable and profound. It requires us to tolerate the fact that the other person is not us, that they see differently, feel differently, need differently, and to find connection across that difference rather than despite it. The narcissist cannot do this, not fully, not in the way that genuine intimacy requires, because genuine intimacy demands the surrender of control over how one is seen. And that surrender, as we have established across everything we have discussed, is the one thing the narcissist's psychological architecture is specifically designed to prevent. And so instead of encountering you as a separate person, they encounter you as a surface, a reflective surface, one that they need to return to them, a particular image, an image of someone significant, someone admirable, someone whose existence is justified and whose worth is beyond question. This is what Kohut meant when he described the narcissist's need for mirroring. It is not simply the desire for compliments or validation, though it includes those things. It is something more fundamental, the need for another person's gaze to confirm the reality of the self, to make it feel solid, coherent, real, because the narcissist's sense of self, beneath all the performance and the grandiosity, is profoundly unstable. It flickers, It requires constant external input to maintain its shape. And you in this relationship have been one of the primary sources of that input. Now, here is where this becomes directly relevant to the distance they are performing. When the narcissist withdraws, when they create space and silence between you, they are trying to show you that they are not interested in you. One of the things that withdrawal accomplishes, perhaps the most psychologically significant thing it accomplishes, is that it gives them control over the mirror. Because a mirror that is too close, a mirror that reflects back things they did not choose to show, a mirror that has begun through its own pain, its own clarity, its own growing refusal to reflect only what they want to see, to show them something uncomfortably true about themselves, that mirror becomes dangerous. And dangerous things must be managed from a distance. Your growing self-awareness, your legitimate anger, your refusal to keep absorbing what is being handed to you, these are not things the narcissist experiences as your liberation. They experience them as a distortion of the reflection. The mirror is no longer returning the image they need. And so they pull back not because they want less of you, but because they need to. Regulate what your presence is now revealing about them. The distance is not rejection. It is recalibration. They are not done with the mirror. They are adjusting the angle. You are never just a person in this relationship. You are the reflection they built their sense of reality around. And the moment you started showing them something true, the distance was the only way they knew how to protect the image they cannot survive without. Let us be very precise about something that often gets lost in conversations about narcissistic behavior, something that, once you see it clearly, reframes every silence, every withdrawal, every cold and calculated absence you have ever received from this person. And that something is this: the distance is not passive. It has never been passive. What presents itself is simply pulling away as the natural, perhaps even understandable retreat of someone who needs space, who is processing, who is simply not ready to engage, is, in reality, one of the most active and deliberate instruments of control in the entire narcissistic arsenal. I want to sit with that word for a moment, control, because it tends to provoke resistance, particularly in people who have genuine affection for the person who has hurt them. The idea that someone we love, someone we may still love, was operating from a place of control feels cold. It feels calculated. It feels incompatible with the warmth and the connection that were also real, at least in their moments. And so we resist the word. We reach instead for kinder explanations. They are overwhelmed. They are afraid. They need time. And while all of those things may contain partial truth, they become dangerous when they are used to obscure the fuller picture. Because the fuller picture is this: whatever the underlying emotional reason for the withdrawal, its function in the relationship is control. And function in psychology matters enormously. The mechanism works like this: when the narcissist withdraws, when the warmth evaporates, when the responses become monosyllabic, when the presence that once felt so consuming suddenly becomes ghost-like and unreachable, something happens in you. Something automatic, something that bypasses rational thought entirely and operates at the level of the nervous system. Anxiety rises. The questions begin. What did I do? What changed? How do I get back to the version of this that felt safe and connected and real? And almost without realizing it, you begin to pursue, to reach, to soften whatever edges may have sharpened in you, to make yourself more available, more accommodating, more carefully attuned to their needs and their moods, because the alternative, the continued silence, feels unbearable. And the moment that happens, the moment your anxiety translates into pursuit, the power dynamic is restored. Not through conversation, not through honesty, not through any of the relational tools that healthy connection requires, but through absence alone. The narcissist has, without saying a single word, recalibrated the entire emotional landscape of the relationship in their favor. They have reminded your nervous system who holds the warmth, and therefore who holds the power. And they have done it in a way that leaves no fingerprints, because how do you confront someone for being quiet? How do you name silence as a weapon without sounding to an outside observer like the unreasonable one? This is the particular genius of emotional withdrawal as a control strategy. It is, in the language of psychology, a form of intermittent reinforcement, the same mechanism that makes gambling addictive. That keeps a person returning to a slot machine long after logic has told them to walk away. The unpredictable alternation between warmth and coldness, between presence and absence, between connection and withdrawal, creates in the nervous system a state of hypervigilance that is almost indistinguishable from obsession. You are not weak for being affected by it. You are human, and your nervous system is responding exactly as it was conditioned to respond. The silence was never empty. It was always sending a message, and the message, stripped of all its packaging, has always been the same. The distance they handed you was not a pause in the relationship. It was the relationship being conducted by other means. And every moment you spent trying to close that distance was a moment they spent confirming that the strategy was working exactly as intended. We have established that the narcissist distances performance, that their detachment is obsession in disguise, that you are the mirror they cannot put down, and that their silence is one of the most effective control strategies available to them. But now I want to introduce something that tends to genuinely surprise people, something that cuts against the narrative of narcissistic invulnerability that we have perhaps unconsciously absorbed. Because for all the power the narcissist appears to hold in this dynamic, for all the apparent ease with which they seem to exist in your absence, there is one specific moment in which that power evaporates almost entirely, and that moment is the moment you stop pursuing, not the moment you get angry, not the moment you issue ultimatums or make demands or try to force accountability into a space that has been specifically engineered to resist it. Those moments, as understandable as they are, tend to confirm the narcissist's existing narrative that you are unstable, that you are the problem, that their withdrawal was justified. I am talking about something far more radical and far more destabilizing to their internal world than any confrontation could ever be. I am talking about genuine absence. The moment you become not angry and pursuing, but simply and quietly unreachable. That moment, and if you have ever experienced it from the other side, even briefly, you will recognize exactly what I am describing, is when the narcissist's internal world begins to fracture in ways that their carefully maintained exterior gives no indication of, because your presence, as we have discussed, is something they know how to manage. They have developed over years and sometimes decades an entire repertoire of strategies for regulating what your presence means, what it reflects, how much power it holds, and how to calibrate the distance between you to keep the dynamic in their favor. Your presence, even when it is painful, even when it is full of anger or grief or desperate pursuit, is known territory. They have a map for it. Your absence, they do not have a map for. And this is where the psychology becomes particularly illuminating. The narcissist's sense of self, as we established when we talked about the mirror, is dependent on external regulation in a way that most people's is not. It requires the continuous input of other people's attention, reaction, and emotional response to maintain its stability. When that input is suddenly withdrawn, not reduced, not made conditional, but genuinely, quietly, completely withdrawn, the system that depends on it does not simply adjust. It destabilizes. The internal noise that your presence was helping to regulate, however dysfunctionally, suddenly has nothing to push against. And in that silence, their silence, the one they created, now reflected back at them by yours, they are confronted with something that their entire psychological architecture was built to avoid. Themselves, unmediated, unregulated, without the mirror, without the pursuit, without the anxiety of someone reaching for them that confirms they are worth reaching for. Just themselves, alone with the self that was never fully formed, in the quiet that their own withdrawal has now made absolute. The philosopher Blaise Pascal observed, with remarkable prescience, that all of humanity's problems stem from the inability to sit quietly in a room alone. He was not. Writing about narcissism, the clinical concept did not exist in his time, but he was writing about something that sits at the very heart of it. The terror of the unmediated self. The desperate need for distraction, for stimulation, for the presence of others to drown out the unbearable volume of one's own inner world when it is not being managed from the outside. Your absence forces the narcissist into that room. and they do not know how to sit in it. You were never powerless in this dynamic. You were simply looking for your power in the wrong place. The moment you stopped being findable was the moment you became, for the first time, genuinely unforgettable. We have arrived at the end of this particular journey together. And I want to be honest with you about something before we close, because I think you deserve that honesty. And because everything we have discussed today has been building quietly and deliberately toward this final and most important point. We have spent considerable time inside the narcissist's mind. We have mapped their obsession, their fear, their dependency, their strategies, their fractures, and there is value in all of that. Understanding the architecture of what happened to you is never wasted effort. Clarity, even when it is painful, is always preferable to confusion. But here is the question that actually matters. Here is the one that will determine not what happened to you in the past, but what happens to you from this moment forward. And it is not whether you are living in their mind. We have established that you are. It is not whether their distance is real or performed. We have established that it is performed. The only question that has any genuine bearing on the quality of your life going forward is this: are they still living in yours? Because here is the uncomfortable truth that sits at the heart of everything we have discussed today. In trying to understand them, in trying to make sense of the dynamic, in trying to decode the silence and the withdrawal and the obsession dressed as indifference, we can, without realizing it, simply replace one form of preoccupation with another. We can move from being consumed by the relationship to being consumed by the analysis of the relationship. And while the latter feels more empowered, more intentional, more psychologically sophisticated than simply waiting by the phone, it can, if we are not careful, become its own form of the same trap. A more intellectually respectable way of keeping them at the center of our inner world. The psychologist Bessel van der Kolk, in his landmark work on trauma, makes a distinction that I find extraordinarily relevant here. He draws a line between understanding what happened to you and being released from what happened to you. And his point, arrived at through decades of clinical work with trauma survivors, is that understanding alone is rarely sufficient for release. The mind can comprehend and experience completely. In the body, the nervous system, the habitual patterns of thought and attention, they can remain entirely captured by it. Knowledge is the beginning of freedom. It is not freedom itself. So what does actual freedom look like in this context? What does it mean practically and not just philosophically to reclaim the mental real estate you have been unknowingly renting to someone who is never going to pay? It begins, I think, with a recognition, a moment of clear-eyed honesty in which you acknowledge that the space they occupy in your mind is no longer serving you, that it was never really about understanding them, but about the hope, however buried, however disguised by analysis and insight and intellectual framework, that understanding them would somehow bring them back, or bring you justice, or bring you the acknowledgement that we talked about in our earlier conversation, the one your nervous system has been waiting for, the one that may never arrive in the form you need it to. And then it requires a choice, not a single dramatic choice made once and forever, but a quiet, repeated daily choice to redirect your attention back toward yourself, toward your own life, your own healing, your own becoming. Every moment you spend inside their psychology is a moment borrowed from your own. Every theory you construct about their inner world is energy diverted from the rebuilding of yours. And you have spent enough time as a resident of someone else's story. You are not a supporting character in the narrative of their healing, their fear, their obsession, their unresolved wounds. You are the main character of your own life. And the most radical thing you can do, more radical than confrontation, more radical than analysis, more radical than waiting for an apology or an acknowledgement or a moment of genuine reckoning that may never come, is to begin living like that is true. They may never stop thinking about you, but the day you stop organizing your inner world around them is the day you finally, completely, and irrevocably take your life back, and that is a freedom no one can perform their way out of, and no silence can ever take from you.